Rollins knew he was going to have a problem as soon as the elf stepped through the door. The way the elf looked around the tavern with disgust as he carefully walked to an empty table spoke of a person who was used to a more cultured environment. The look of disdain he had for the humans, Dordan, and even other elves also showed him as a person who thought he deserved to be in better company. Despite his obvious discomfort, the elf still ordered a meal, picking at it and sipping at the water Rollins had offered for over an hour, taking up a valuable seat from potential customers, eventually forcing Rollins to walk up to the elf and see what he could do to hasten his departure. "Hello, dear, customer. Sorry for, interrupting your meal." "Ah," the elf replied, an arrogant smile forming on his once sneering face. "I knew this moment would come, and I am ready." "Ah, well, good. That, certainly makes things easier." "Of course it does, for I would not wish to impede your search for knowledge." What?" "Let me ease your burden by answering your most burning question. Yes, despite my features and mannerisms being much more refined than those of my kin you've seen before, I am in fact an elf. An elf from a realm where knowledge is power, and our light serves as a beacon to all those who would bring order to all." "I think there's been a bit of a miscommunication." "Human, let me tell you of the Lumineth Realmlords." "You're not listening to a word I'm saying, are you?" "In the beginning." In the beginning of the Age of Myth, the elves who would later become known as the Lumineth Realmlords were brought to the realm of light, Hysh, by the twin gods Teclian and Teclis, and under the guidance of these two wise beings, these elves formed a culture of betterment that spread throughout the 10 paradises, what they called the 10 vast continents that comprised Hysh. As they spread across these paradises, each elf chose a path of improvement wherever their interests lay. Some traveled inward, aiming to explore the vistas of their minds, seeking ways to unleash their full potential. Others traveled outward, exploring Hysh as pioneers, writing elegant tomes of biology and botany as they studied every form of life on each paradise, as well as trying to subdue the more dangerous creatures that inhabited them. They tamed those they could, but those creatures that were a bit too wild, even for their expert hands, were gently guided to other realms, for the elves were not savages, and wouldn't dream of outright slaughtering creatures for just fulfilling their nature. Instead, they just made those wild beasts someone else's problem. I would rather say they introduced them to environments more suited to their temperaments. Sure. These pursuits of knowledge were eventually formalized into a series of steps called the Teclimentari, sometimes simply called the Teclian ladder. Each rung of this ladder represented an advancement in the pursuit of becoming a higher being, showcasing an improved mastery of the mind and soul. To graduate from one rung to another was a strenuous mental test, and not many survived with their sanity intact. Along with the advancement of knowledge came the expansion of their city-states, known as the Great Nations, and in each of these nations, every elf with an interest in art and architecture took every opportunity to improve their craft. Every few years, new citadels, palaces, and spires were built that were taller and more ambitious than the last, and it wasn't uncommon for a friendly rivalry to form between elves in related fields, a friendliness that soon turned sour with the discovery of Hyshian Realmstone. Now, unlike other forms of Realmstone, the Realmstone of Hysh was not originally a solid, but beams of light that constantly traveled across the realm. Wait, isn't the Realmstone of Shaman a liquid metal? Well, technically, and I'm pretty sure the Realmstone of Olgo is a gas. You are surprisingly learned for a human tavern keeper, and you are unsurprisingly condescending for an elven ass. Oh, apologies, where was I? Right. The rarity of the solidity of Realmstone aside, Teclis was able to take this particular form of Realmstone, these pure beams of light, and compress them into a solid form, forming a substance he called aetherquartz. When properly prepared, this aetherquartz allowed those who touched it to absorb its power and become enlightened in mind, body, and spirit. It raised intellect, lent dexterity to limbs, gave focus to one's pursuits, and perhaps most importantly, gave a critical boost to aspirants hoping to ascend the Teclian ladder. But, like in all things, a balance must be maintained. As the light within the aetherquartz was consumed, it would be replaced by a few of the more unnecessary emotions of its host, a small price to pay for enlightenment. Once spent of its light, the aetherquartz became a stone full of raw and potentially harmful emotions. Stones which were safely disposed of in a chasm near the city of Cathartia. You just threw them all into a pit? My good tavern keeper, it was a chasm, and I assure you, it was very deep. Soon, the harnessing of aetherquartz became a focus of elven artifice. Elves began embedding aetherquartz into jewelry, clothing, armor, weapons, anywhere on their person where they could have easy access to it at any moment. Elven society became obsessed with using this aetherquartz to its fullest, and with it the speed of elven progress skyrocketed. It looked like nothing in the realms could stop them from reaching any goal. However, this new perspective came at a terrible price. This may be hard for you to believe, Tavern Keeper, but we elves, even the elves of Hysh, are not immune to mortal failings. We, perhaps more than most, have been known to suffer from the sin of pride. Once aetherquartz was introduced into their society, this pride tainted the pure search for knowledge and betterment that was the elven people's core philosophy. No more was their focus simply on improving one's craft. Soon, all that mattered was outdoing their peers. Friendly competition and banter became sabotage and barbed wording. Elven masters openly attempting to outdo rivals, and giving cloaked insults to those who blatantly show their excellence. Even endeavors of the mind were not immune to this pride. Study became less about what you learned in the pursuit of knowledge, and more about how much more you knew than others. How many lectures enough went to and how far they were above others on the Teclian ladder, mattering more than enlightenment. Many were abusing aetherquartz to forsake sleep and sustenance, in order to advance even faster, deteriorating their bodies and minds in the process. But perhaps the most devastating change due to pride was in magecraft. Mages were compelled to craft spells that were flashier, grander, and most importantly, deadlier than those of their peers. The elven people eventually crafting spells that could potentially unravel reality itself. Spells mages swore they would never use, and were simply an option in case of chaos incursion. Now I should mention that the elves of Hysh were not ignorant of the threat of chaos. Unlike the other gods, Teclis and Tyrion shared knowledge of the world that was with their people freely, believing that such knowledge would better protect them from the influence of the dark powers. But with aetherquartz clouding their minds, the threat of chaos was, if not forgotten, at least ignored. So focused were they on outdoing their peers, that the elves didn't notice the subtle whispers of the Dark Prince Lanesh and their servants. Whispers that slowly turned into words and suggestions the elves arrogantly believed came from their own minds. And where were Teclis and Tyrion during all of this? Our gods were meeting with the Pantheon of Order, and performing godly duties in other realms, fully believing that their people were more than capable of guiding themselves. Sadly, that was not the case. Soon, elven society reached a point of no return, as a heated argument between two rivals resulted in the destruction of their towers. A taboo had been broken, and violence was seen as a viable means to end the dispute. Simple slander turned into accusation of criminal activity or worse, demonic influence. Baseless accusations that were used to paint social enemies as the most vile of fiends, and with those accusations, outright attacks began to occur. Not physical, of course, but through spellcraft. The elves soon began unleashing the direst of enchantments and the most powerful of magical weapons. An all-out war that blasted buildings, flattened entire districts, and even shook apart nearby mountains. And with these magics, the veil between Hysh and the realm of chaos ripped open, beginning a time that would eventually be known as the Okari Dara, or the Spirefall, where the elves suffered the consequences of their actions. For waiting on the other side of the veil were the demons that were birthed from their pride, ready to rip apart the very elves that gave them life. While some elves blindly continued their wars of pride, those more level-headed amongst them saw the threat of chaos, and fought bravely to protect the realm. And it was around this time that the twin gods Tyrion and Teclis returned. Tyrion immediately began leading the defense, the master of war leading the armed forces against over 100 chaos incursions over the decades. While Tyrion fought in the physical realm, Teclis looked for a solution in the spiritual. Meditating in the wilderness, his spirit floated into the etheric void, the dark space between and beyond the realms. And traveling through it, he spoke with unknowable beings beyond the realm sphere seeking new wisdom, and it was in his search that he discovered a wise being much closer than he thought possible. Hysh's solitary moon, Selenar. You see, Despite the supposed mastery of Hysh, the elves never knew that parts of the realm, including its moon, were alive. These beings that inhabited but also were these objects came to be known as elementari. In layman's terms, they were the spirits of the land. After months of communion, Teclian returned to Hysh with Selenar at his side, the moon now in the form of a majestic and wise beast. Together they gathered the most selfless and repentant of the elven people, those who originally saw where the path of pride would lead their people, and those that were tainted by that pride but were stripped of it into harsh flames of war. These elves became the first that Teclian taught the method to bond with the geomantic spirits of Hysh, a process that was not easy for a people that for so long wished to gain mastery of every subject imaginable. For to bind with the spirit, one must choose to let the spirit's wisdom guide them in all things. Those seeking such a path had to first choose an elementor as their spiritual node, whether it be a mountain, a river, or light itself. Once chosen, the elf must then divest themselves of all they have ever accrued, whether that be material possessions, preconceptions, or strictures of knowledge. And once done, they must then endure their chosen element, diving into the deepest rivers, climbing and meditating on the highest mountains, burning themselves in the harshest light, until, once they believe themselves ready, they fully put their fate in the spirit's hands. For example, an elf that chose a river as its elementor would, after a lengthy time communing with their chosen spirit, bind weights to their limbs and sink to its depths. If the river spirit found them worthy, they would not only be pushed up to the surface, but also gain the ability to breathe underwater, as well as other abilities tied to their new spiritual guardian. If the aspirant was not deemed worthy, you can guess what happened to the elf, and thus began what would later be known as the War of Reinvention, a long, bloody, and strife-filled period in which the elves strove to defeat the demons that assaulted their realm, while also gaining new perspective and wisdom that altered their society entirely. Near the end of the war, Teclian cast his eyes across the entirety of Hysh, salvaging what land he could, and using geomantic symbols to seal off those areas where reality was sundered, consolidating the realm into a smaller but untainted form. Soon after, the elves founded several elementary temples across Hysh, all tied to the spirits of the land that give these elves wisdom and, when necessary, power. No more were these the elves that were corrupted by their pride. These were now a people whose core was based on humility and a yearning for cooperation, a people who wished to use their hard-earned wisdom to bring their light to the darkest parts of the realms. That was a great story and all, but, and I mean this with the utmost respect, you don't really seem to be flowing with this humility the Lumineth Realmlords are supposed to be known for. You sound like my former tutors, Tavern Keeper. I left Hysh to prove to them and others that I am the most humble elf they will ever see. Sadly, just as I began my journey, I met with some ruffians. Despite my boundless charisma, they absconded with some valuable items of mine. So they mugged you. A crude but accurate way of saying it, which means you don't have the money to pay for the food you just ate. Technically, no. But I assure you, I am willing to work for my meal. Are you perhaps in need of a scribe or an accountant? I've got a better idea. My old server recently quit, and I need someone to replace her. Not exactly what I had in mind, but you will find me up to the task. May I ask, why did she leave your employment? She heard some Ogre mercenaries were gonna pass through town. Oh, was she afraid they were going to consume her? Not really. Ogre mercenaries tend to be professionals as long as you keep paying and feeding them. She left because our chamber ponds aren't really built for Ogre constitutions, and she really didn't want to clean up the mess. Oh no. Oh yes.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on the Lumineth Realmlords. If you like it, please like, subscribe, comment, press the little bell so you know whenever I post, etc, etc, so the YouTube guys know I exist and hopefully more people might see my content. Let's see. If you really like it and you have the cash to spare, please also consider sending a little money away to my Patreon or my Coffee account. The extra money gives me time to work on these stories I love. Anyway, thank you for listening/watching, and see you next time.